Molweni, Dimelang, Sanbonani, Absheni, Nda. Namhlanje sothetha ulimi or indigenous language ngesilungu. Now, often when one thinks of indigenous language, you often see it as an alternative way of communication and do not acknowledge the significance behind our indigenous language. And just to prove that, according to UNESCO, one language disappears every 2 weeks. And according to the Organization Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger, 230 languages went extinct between 1950 and 2010. So clearly you can see that our indigenous languages are not appreciated. Now, today I've been able to get hold of an expert by the name of Florence gonouya.
Yes.
And Florence gonouya studied at the University of Zimbabwe. She did a teaching degree there. And then she's now a teacher at Radley Private School. So, ma'am, welcome to Witubo South Africa.
Thank you so much, Tabang, for having me. Kutenda nekundikoka pa mtambo wako uri kuita wemutauro wevanhu vakasiyana siyana. So what I've said is...
Okay. And then you were busy translating what you said in Shona. It stopped there.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so what I said in Shona... Yeah, what I said in Shona is that thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to come and talk about the value of our indigenous languages.
Yes, and I think to better start off the interview, I think we need to define what exactly is language, right? So what I did is that I went to the Oxford Dictionary, and it defines language as a system of communication in speech and writing that is used by a people of a country, right? So the question would be then, is there more to language than it being a medium of communication, looking at it from an indigenous perspective?
I believe there is more to language. It's more than just a medium of communication, especially if you look at it in the indigenous context, because if we talk about being indigenous, we're talking about our culture. We are talking about our identity. And our culture, our identity is made up of our values, our religion, our history. And the only way you can have that as an identity for yourself is through language. You have to be told about all these things through factual information, through storytelling, through reading the history of your culture. So language is definitely not just for communication.
Speaking about culture, is there a link between our indigenous language and our culture?
There is. You cannot have a culture without language. You cannot have language without a culture. Because for you to be able to identify with your identity, you have to have knowledge of it. How do you get that knowledge? It's through being told about it, through language. For example, in our Shona culture, we have totems, which are your ancestors, what their totem is, what their symbol is, what that symbol is. And these symbols are usually animals. For example, my totem is morph, which is an antelope. And then there's a long poem that tells you the history, the characteristics, the attributes of a person whose totem is morph. And if you call me by my female name, totem name, it's Rachihera. So if someone calls me Rachihera, they'll know that my totem is morph. And how do I learn about all that? It's through language. And what language do I use to learn about all that? It's definitely not a Western language. It's my indigenous language that teaches me about all those things that make me, a Shona person, that makes me a person with a totem that identifies me to the other cultures. So definitely language has to be part and parcel of culture for us to be able to identify with it.
Speaking about totems, um, in also in our Sesotho culture, some will say kitau, meaning I'm a lion, right?
Yes,
And uh, clearly there's a connection between Mother Nature and the language and
yes,
our culture and biodiversity,
mm,
right?
yes.
So does the indigenous language connect us with the land, with Mother Nature? Does it strengthen our connection with the land as opposed to English?
It definitely does. It definitely does because you know that in all our histories we have our ancestors, and the Western people came with Christianity, but we had our own religion, which was from our ancestors, and you'll find we have those sacred places with those sacred names
Mm,
where you know that if you talk about some of those names, you don't even say them because they're so sacred. And we have the names in our indigenous languages. So definitely
mm,
language and nature are part and parcel of our culture. We have the names of the animals, we have the names of the trees, and we have meanings in those names.
mm,
For example, in Zimbabwe, we have a place where we have a tree. If you look at that tree, you should be, you know, trees have different names. You look at a tree, it's a baobab tree. You look at a tree, it's a pipani tree. But then we have a tree that doesn't have just one set of characteristics that defines what it is. And we call that tree a tree without a name. So, and it's in one place. So if you talk about that, you know that it's a place somewhere, and it's a very sacred place. So definitely, indigenous languages are part and parcel of our culture, nature, and all those things.
And then, do you know why our ancestors resorted to oral and not writing?
I think it's all about the period, the time period, because you'll find writing came later on in life when people decided we need to have a system of putting language down on paper. And even in that, you have different writings that changed with time. But I believe that our ancestors actually did have a writing, although most of it was oral. But we have our cave paintings. If you go to those places which are still having still untouched by modern people, where you have your caves and you go there, you find the rock paintings. You see them telling stories. It's like in Egypt, we have the hieroglyphics by the Egyptians.
Mm.
So they had their own writing. It's just that it's not the writing that we now have for ourselves. But definitely, I think if we go back to where we came from, there's still signs of writing
Mm.
that our ancestors used. But definitely, they were more oral than written.
And then speaking about hieroglyphics, I'm getting an idea that we had our own indigenous knowledge system. We had our own writing, our own arts, our own paintings and drawings, right? And I'm thinking that that could only be understood by embracing the indigenous language, right?
True.
True.
Yes. Very true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, looking at this modern society, they say the 21st century,
Mm.
what would then be the benefit of giving attention to our indigenous languages?
I think the benefit is timeless. It's not about modern society. It's not about our ancestors, because I think indigenous language equals culture.
Mm,
Or those two equal your identity. So your identity should remain intact, no matter what time period you're in, whether it's the modern time, it's Stone Age time, your identity has to be yours and it should not be diluted by time. Because what does that mean then? It means you're allowing the things that happen in that era, like now, if you talk about the modern era, what is happening in our era that is now diluting the essence of my identity to the point where it ceases to exist. So I think time should not take away my identity. It shouldn't. My identity should stay the same no matter what time period I'm in.
Funny enough, it's actually said that in the next 500 years, English may not be the spoken language globally. They may actually be replaced by Mandarin or a different language that would be more powerful than the English language. So it gives us even much of a reason to appreciate our indigenous languages, right?
True.
True. And then looking at the practicality of embracing our indigenous language, in this Western kind of civilization where in primary school, high school, when you go look for a job, university, it is required for you to know English. It is required for you to know certain Western ideologies if you want to move forward in life. So, what would then be the practicality around really embracing our indigenous languages?
I think it's we have to accept the fact that English is the medium of communication on the international stage. It's the medium of communication in the global village that we're in now. But you see, it's because we decided as a people to let that happen, and it made everything easier for people to communicate with one language. And just the same as we made that happen, we can still make it happen that we now put our indigenous languages at par with English on an international stage in a global village. And how do we do that? I believe it starts at home. Parents will teach their children to have pride in their identity. Their identity equals their indigenous language. So children should be able to say, I am fluent in my own indigenous language. We go to schools. We now put so much importance on English. If you don't pass English at matric level, you fail, irrelevant of the fact that you've done well in all other subjects. You have to pass English. So we do the same. You should pass an indigenous language for people to say you have passed matric. We have to get to that stage. And then up there, we have to also, in the business world, bring those indigenous languages that we've taught our children at home, at school. It should be used throughout, because the problem is we stop using the languages when we get out of school and we forget about them. So in the business world, we should also say we can have a meeting in an indigenous language with different races sitting at the same table, speaking an indigenous language from beginning to end. And that way, we bring our indigenous languages to the same level of we have with English.
So